Story 1. The Mysterious Passenger. I've been working as a taxi driver in a regional city in Kyushu for 10 years now. Lately, the economy hasn't been the best, and customers have been fewer and farther between. The regular routes were getting monotonous, and so I thought I'd switch things up, try new areas in the hope of finding more passengers. I headed to the northern side of the city, where there were fewer homes but more commercial areas and, notably, a large cemetery. Cemeteries might not sound like the best place to find customers, but in this area, temples surrounded the cemetery, and a few shops sold gravestones and flowers. I figured some people visiting loved ones might need a ride afterward, so it was worth a shot. I let the engine idle as I slowly cruised through the streets near the cemetery gates. There was a stillness in the air that wasn't unusual for this part of town, but something about it felt heavier than usual. The sun was setting, and a light fog had begun to roll in from the surrounding hills. As I turned onto a narrow street flanked by towering trees, a strange scent started to fill the car, even though the windows were all rolled up. It was subtle at first, almost like damp earth, but it grew stronger, more pungent, like something decaying. Instinctively, I rolled down the windows to air out the car, and as I did, I saw a woman standing by the entrance of the cemetery, her hand raised as she flagged me down. She was dressed in what looked like a faded white kimono, her face slightly obscured by the hood of her jacket. I didn't think too much of it at the time. People often wore traditional clothing when visiting graves, but there was something strange about the way she stood. Her posture was stiff, almost unnatural. I pulled over and unlocked the door. She slipped into the back seat without a word, keeping her head down as she mumbled the destination in a voice so soft I barely caught it. I repeated her destination to confirm, and she nodded ever so slightly, her face still turned away from me. We set off, and though the silence was normal for my line of work, there was an oppressive feeling in the car that I couldn't shake. Every now and then, I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, but she didn't move. Her hands were clenched in her lap, her long hair obscuring her face, and she sat completely still, too still. A few minutes into the drive, the strange scent returned, stronger this time, and unmistakably foul. It was as if something rotten had been left in the back seat, but I had cleaned my car just the day before. I wrinkled my nose and rolled down the windows again, hoping the fresh air would help. That's when the woman finally spoke. "I'm sorry. It's my smell." Her voice was distant, almost robotic, like someone reciting a line from a script. I turned around, puzzled by her comment, and that's when I noticed her eyes, dark, hollow, and void of any reflection. They were fixed on me through the rearview mirror, and the sight of them sent a cold chill down my spine. It was then that she muttered something else, words that I could barely understand. "It wasn't you. You weren't the one." I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as some strange customer behavior, and continued driving. But the eerie feeling only intensified. The smell grew stronger, nearly overwhelming, and I began to feel lightheaded. We were driving for what felt like hours, though it had only been about 30 minutes. We reached a residential area, and I pulled over near a quiet street where she had asked to be dropped off. "Is this the right place?" I asked, but there was no response. I turned around, and to my shock, she was gone. The back seat was completely empty, though I hadn't heard the door open, nor had the car stopped moving long enough for her to get out. The smell lingered in the air, so thick that I could hardly breathe, but there was no trace of the woman. On the seat where she had been sitting, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. An old, worn handkerchief, stained and smelling faintly of incense and earth. Later that evening, as I finished my shift, I couldn't shake the unease. The next day, I learned from a fellow driver that a woman who lived in the house where I had dropped her off had been reported missing weeks earlier. She had vanished after visiting the grave of her late husband and had never been seen again. The strangest part? The description of the missing woman matched my passenger perfectly, right down to the white kimono. I tried to rationalize the experience, telling myself that it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew that what I had seen was something far more sinister. To this day, the scent of damp earth and incense still haunts me every time I drive near the cemetery. few years ago, a taxi driver told me a story that still gives me chills. This happened in one of those dangerous neighborhoods in the city, the kind of place where you think twice before venturing out late at night. The driver, let's call him Rob, used to work the night shift. He said the fares were better, and there was less traffic to deal with. One night, around 2 a.m., he picked up a passenger downtown and drove them out to one of those sketchy neighborhoods on the outskirts. He knew it wasn't a safe area, but work was work, so he went. After dropping the passenger off, Rob decided to take a different route back, a shortcut through even darker, narrower streets. As he drove, the air got colder, which was strange because it was summer. He had this growing feeling that something wasn't right. The streetlights were flickering, casting these creepy shadows on the walls and fences. Then he saw them, 3 women standing on a corner, dressed in long, dark gowns. Their hair was wild and covered most of their faces. At first, Rob thought they were waiting for a taxi, so he slowed down. One of the women raised her hand, signaling him to stop. As he got closer, something about them made him feel uneasy. But he stopped anyway. The woman approached the window, and that's when Rob noticed something terrifying. Her eyes, they were completely black. No pupils, no iris, just darkness. Before he could react, the other 2 women rushed up to the car, laughing in this eerie, disturbing way. They started banging on the car, trying to get in. Rob, trying to keep calm, asked the woman at his window where she wanted to go. She smiled, this creepy, unnatural smile. And in a voice that seemed to echo inside his head, she said, "Take us to a place where it never dawns." Rob felt like the air was being sucked out of the car, like something was pushing down on him. His instincts kicked in and he slammed his foot on the gas. He sped off, glancing in the rearview mirror. What he saw made his blood run cold. The 3 women weren't just standing there anymore. They were floating in the air. Their dresses billowed out like wings, and their eyes, now glowing in the dark, followed him as he drove away. They let out these awful sounds, like laughter mixed with crying. Rob didn't stop until he reached a main road, where the oppressive feeling started to fade. He pulled into a gas station, shaking, his hands still gripping the wheel. The attendant saw him and asked if he was okay. Rob, still in shock, told him what had just happened. Instead of laughing it off, the guy nodded slowly and said, "Oh, you just ran into the witches." He went on to explain that there are old stories about women in that neighborhood who practice dark magic. They've been gone a long time, but some say they still roam the area at night, looking for lost souls to take away. That night was enough for Rob. He stopped working in that neighborhood and made sure never to drive through those streets again, especially not after midnight. Every time he tells this story, you can see the fear in his eyes. Those witches, whatever they were, almost took him to a place where no one comes back from. This story took place more than 20 years ago in Acapulco, in a part of the city that had long since fallen into decay. It was a hot, sticky night, the air so thick with humidity that it felt like you couldn't breathe. I was driving my taxi, hoping to pick up one last fare before calling it a night. As I drove down a nearly empty street, I saw a woman wave me down. She was dressed elegantly, far too well for the rough area we were in. She got into the cab and gave me an address in the old part of the city, an area filled with abandoned buildings and dark streets. She didn't say much, just stared out the window, lost in thought. The ride was quiet, too quiet. There was something unsettling about the silence in the car, and the night felt darker than usual. When we arrived at the address, I saw a man waiting at the entrance of the house. He was tall and incredibly thin, almost skeletal, dressed all in black. His posture gave me chills. The woman got out without saying a word and walked towards him. I watched them disappear into the house through my rearview mirror, feeling uneasy but unsure why. A few days later, I saw the woman again. This time, she was wandering aimlessly down the street, looking lost and disoriented. She seemed worse than before, as if something had drained the life out of her. I stopped to help, but her words made no sense. She was terrified, but I couldn't get anything coherent out of her. I felt helpless, so I left her there. Later that night, I saw the man in black again. This time, he was standing near my taxi base, lurking in the shadows. Despite the dim lighting, I could tell he was watching me. Fear rooted me to the spot for a moment, but I finally managed to shake it off and continue with my night. But it didn't end there. A few nights later, while I was driving on a deserted road outside the city, I saw him again. He was standing on the side of the road, his tall figure silhouetted in the dark. It made no sense. There was no way he could have followed me out there so quickly. I gripped the steering wheel tight and forced myself to keep driving, but the fear gnawed at me. For a few days, I didn't see him, but the unease lingered. Then, one night, a young girl got into my taxi and gave me the address of the same house where I dropped off that woman. As we drove, I tried to warn her, telling her about the man in black and how dangerous he seemed. She brushed it off, saying she didn't believe in that kind of thing. She just wanted to get to her destination. I didn't know what else to do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to stop her from going there. As we neared the house, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let her out. I drove past the street, hoping to convince her to change her mind. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him again. The man in black was standing on the corner, his thin, towering figure almost blending into the darkness. Even though I couldn't see his eyes, I felt his gaze following us. I hit the gas, leaving that street and the terror behind. Since that night, I've avoided the area altogether. I never saw the woman or the man in black again, but the feeling of being watched never fully left me. To this day, I don't know who or what he was, but something about his presence told me I had made a grave mistake by getting involved. It wasn't until I left the city for good that I felt safe again. I still think about it sometimes, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't kept driving. A few years back, something happened to me that I've never been able to fully explain. I drive a taxi in Mexico City, and I usually work the night shift. One rainy night, I was waiting for clients at the airport. It was a slow night, not many people around, when a man approached me, asking for a ride to a destination several hours away. He offered nearly double the normal fare, enough to make it worth my while. Without thinking twice, I agreed. The man was tall, with a gray beard, dressed in an expensive-looking dark blue suit. He looked like a businessman, but there was something about his eyes that unsettled me. Still, I got in the taxi and we started the long drive. He didn't say much, just stared out the window and asked that I not play any music or turn on the radio. The hours passed, and the city slowly gave way to the darkness of the highway. The silence between us was thick, almost unbearable. After what felt like forever, we finally arrived at a small, nearly deserted town. The streets were empty, the few lights flickering weakly. The man pointed to where I should stop, paid the fare, and left without saying another word. As soon as he disappeared, I knew I didn't want to stay there any longer than necessary. So, I quickly turned around and started my journey back to the city. That's when things got strange. As I drove, the road felt different, unfamiliar. I checked the map several times, but it all seemed correct. Yet, every mile I drove, I felt like I was stuck in a loop. The same trees, the same traffic signs, over and over. Time passed, but it felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. The night seemed endless, and it scared me more than I could explain. Eventually, I pulled over at a small viewpoint. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of a distant cricket. I got out of the car, hoping to get my bearings, but nothing made sense. Everything around me seemed identical, like the world had shifted and I was lost in some strange version of it. Frustrated and desperate, I decided to keep driving. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a light in the distance. Relieved, I sped towards it, hoping to find my way out of this bizarre situation. But when I got there, I found only a small, nearly abandoned gas station. The light from the pole outside was still on, though the place looked deserted. I decided to stop and check the car. As I did, an old man came out of the office. He had a strange smile and a look that seemed to see right through me. He asked if I needed help, and I told him what had happened. He nodded slowly, almost knowingly, and said, "Sometimes, The roads play tricks on your mind. I asked him how I could get out of there, and he simply told me to keep driving. You'll find your way back, he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I wasn't convinced, but I didn't have much choice. So I got back in the car and did as he said. I kept driving, trying to stay calm. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the lights of the city finally appeared on the horizon. I've never felt so relieved in my life. I accelerated, desperate to leave that strange road behind. When I got back to the airport, it was like no time had passed at all. My shift hadn't ended, and everything looked exactly as I had left it, as if the hours I spent driving through that endless night hadn't even happened. It was as if I had been asleep at the wheel and everything I experienced was just some vivid dream. To this day, I don't know what really happened that night. Sometimes I think it was some glitch in time, other times just a weird dream. But I've never accepted another fare that takes me far from the city, especially not down that road. I hope my story didn't bore you, and to my fellow taxi drivers, I urge you to share your own experiences. Sometimes, telling these stories is the only way to make sure you're not going crazy. One night, I had a ride that I'll never forget. It started out normal, picking up a young man from the Bogota airport. We got to talking about football, comparing our cities. He was from Buenos Aires, and his girlfriend was from Medellin. The night was dark, but what really set the mood was the thickening fog that seemed to swallow everything around us. As we headed towards Cerro de Montserrat, the atmosphere changed. The street became eerily quiet, completely deserted, with the fog so thick that the streetlights barely cut through. That's when we saw her, a woman standing in the middle of the road, emerging from the fog. She was wearing a black dress with a gray sweater draped over her shoulders, her long hair spilling down her back. But she didn't move. She just stood there, motionless, like she was waiting for something or someone. I slowed the car to a stop, keeping a safe distance. I switched on the emergency lights in case any other cars came speeding down the road. I glanced over at my passenger, and his eyes were wide with fear. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us staring at the woman. The air in the car felt thick, like it was getting harder to breathe. I decided to get out and see if she needed help, but just as I was about to open the door, my passenger practically screamed, "Don't get out! The lady doesn't have any feet." His voice was full of panic. I looked again, focusing on her feet, and he was right. They looked blurry, almost transparent, like they weren't fully there. It was a chilling sight. I stayed in the car, and the young man kept urging me to drive away. I tried to keep calm and prepared to turn the car around, but then the woman started moving. She didn't turn to look at us, just slowly walked to the side of the road, still facing away. We were both terrified, afraid that she would suddenly turn and reveal her face. But before she could, her figure began to fade, dissolving into the fog until she was completely gone, as if she'd never been there at all. We didn't say a word, both of us too scared to speak. My heart was pounding, and I could tell his was too. I drove as fast as I could to get him to his destination, trying to leave the memory of what we'd just seen behind. When we arrived, the young man was still visibly shaken. Before he got out, he asked me to wait until his girlfriend came to open the door for him. I waited, and as soon as she appeared, I drove off quickly, eager to get back to a busy area. I decided to end my shift early that night. I'd had enough. To anyone listening from Colombia, I know there are more stories like this out there. Don't be afraid to share them. We all have experiences that remind us that there's more to this world than we understand. It was the summer before our third year of college, and my friends and I were looking for something exciting to do before the semester started. We were all big fans of ghost stories and haunted places, so when one of my friends suggested we visit a rumored haunted spot outside the prefecture, we jumped at the chance. I had just bought a car, and with nothing but time on our hands, we decided to make the most of it. Our destination? An old, abandoned hotel nestled deep in the mountains. It had once been a thriving luxury resort, but had been shut down after a string of strange occurrences. The most notable incident was the suicide of a woman on the 5th floor, and after that, the hotel's reputation plummeted. The hotel closed its doors for good when her father also died by jumping off the roof in grief over losing his only daughter. We'd heard all the stories before, and they were enough to send chills down your spine, but we were skeptical. Ghost stories were just stories, right? I wasn't keen on going, though. I had always had a sensitivity to the paranormal, and I'd been affected by strange occurrences before, even getting physically ill after visiting certain places. So when it teased me about being too scared to go, I reluctantly declined. The last thing I needed was to be haunted by something I didn't even believe in. So, while my friends, A, B, C, and D, set off on their ghost hunting adventure around 8 p.m., I stayed behind, waiting to hear their inevitable stories of how they chickened out or didn't find anything unusual. The road to the hotel was long and winding, taking them deep into the mountains. By the time they arrived, it was close to midnight. The air was heavy with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and makes everything feel more oppressive. The moon was out, casting an eerie light on the large, crumbling silhouette of the hotel. The place looked straight out of a horror movie. Its outer walls were covered in ivy, and almost every window was broken or boarded up. The four of them approached the hotel cautiously, flashlights in hand, their beams cutting through the darkness as they made their way inside. The interior was just as decrepit as the outside. Graffiti covered the walls. Empty beer cans and bags of old snacks littered the floor, and a stench of mold and decay filled the air. It was obvious that people had been using the place as a hangout, but there was something else about the hotel that felt off. They explored each floor, going higher and higher, eventually reaching the infamous 5th floor, where the suicide had taken place. The hallway was cold, much colder than the rest of the building, and as they walked, they swore they could hear whispers, though there was no one else in the hotel. When they reached the room where the woman had died, they found the door slightly ajar. Inside, the air was thick with the same foul odor they had smelled earlier, and the room itself looked untouched since the day the hotel closed. The wallpaper was peeling, and the bed was still made, though it was covered in dust and debris. Suddenly, they heard a loud banging noise coming from above them, like something heavy had fallen. The sound was followed by a sharp, fishy odor that filled the air. They all froze, exchanging nervous glances, but no one dared to investigate. The smell grew stronger, and they decided it was time to leave. As they hurried down the stairs, the banging continued, each time closer and louder. By the time they reached the lobby, it felt as though the walls were closing in on them, the sound almost deafening. They bolted for the exit and ran toward the car, gasping for fresh air. It was only after they had left the hotel behind that they began to calm down, laughing nervously about how freaked out they had been. But the night wasn't over yet. Just as they were getting into the car, a white figure appeared from the trees on the side of the road, running directly toward them. B, who was driving, hit the brakes hard, but it was too late. The figure collided with the front of the car, bouncing off the hood and disappearing into the darkness. They all jumped out, frantically looking for the person they had hit, but there was no one there. No body, no blood, no sign of any impact at all. The car was completely undamaged. They searched the area, combing through the trees with their flashlights, but they found nothing. It was as if the figure had never been there. Spooked and unsure of what to do, they were about to call the police when a taxi drove by, its reserved sign lit up. The driver, an elderly man, pulled over when he saw them standing by the car. He listened to their story, inspected the car, and then gave them a strange look. "You boys were at that old hotel, weren't you?" he asked, his voice low. "I've heard stories like this before. Strange things happen around there. But don't worry, you didn't hit anything. If it was what I think it was, you wouldn't have left a mark." The driver's words sent a shiver down their spines, but his calm demeanor helped put them at ease. He warned them to stay away from places like that in the future and drove off, leaving them to wonder who or what they had seen. It wasn't until later, as they drove away from the hotel, that they realized something even stranger. B remembered that the taxi had its reserved sign on, meaning it was heading to pick someone up. But the road they had come from was a dead end. The only thing at the end of it was the abandoned hotel. Who could the driver have been going to pick up? The realization sent a wave of fear through them all, and the rest of the drive home was spent in tense, uneasy silence. After that night, none of them ever visited a haunted spot again.